In 1196, Richard the Lionheart looked at a chalk cliff above the River Seine in Normandy and decided to build the most expensive, most advanced, most deliberately provocative castle that Europe had ever seen. 2 years later, he had done exactly that. The fortress perched above the town of Les Andelys cost more to build than every castle Richard owned in England combined. He reportedly looked at his finished creation and called it Gaillard, a word that translates to something between saucy, cheeky, and defiant. All of which perfectly describe the man who built it. But Richard died less than a year after his castle was completed, and within 5 years of his death, the fortress he believed was unbreakable became the site of one of the most horrifying sieges in medieval history. The greatest threat was not the French army outside the walls, it was what happened to the people trapped between them. This is the dark story of Château Gaillard, and it is far worse than you think. To understand why Richard built this castle, you need to understand the rivalry that consumed the last years of his life. Richard the Lionheart was King of England, but he spent almost no time there. His real obsession was holding on to his family's vast territories in France, a patchwork of duchies and counties stretching from Normandy down to the Pyrenees. The problem was that technically, Richard held those French lands as a vassal of the French king, Philip II. And Philip was not the kind of ruler who enjoyed being overshadowed by his own vassal. While Richard was away fighting in the Third Crusade and then imprisoned in Austria on his way home, Philip seized his chance. He invaded Normandy, took key castles, and swallowed up territory that the English crown had held for generations. By the time Richard finally returned in 1194, he had lost ground that would take years to recover. Richard spent those years fighting, and when he signed the Treaty of Louviers with Philip in 1196, the agreement specifically stated that the manor of Andely in Normandy would remain unfortified. Richard looked at that treaty, looked at the strategic gap in his defenses where the castle of Gisors used to stand, and decided the treaty could go to hell. He chose a site on the chalk cliffs of Andely, 300 feet above the River Seine. Every supply barge, every military vessel heading toward the Norman capital of Rouen would have to pass directly beneath his new fortress. The position was perfect, and the castle Richard built there was unlike anything Europe had seen. 3 concentric rings of fortification, separated by dry moats. Walls built in a series of 19 rounded arcs, because curved surfaces absorb the impact of siege weapons far better than flat ones, and they gave archers inside a wider field of fire. Machicolations ran along the battlements, openings in the floor that allowed defenders to drop stones or boiling liquid directly onto attackers below. The inner keep was carved partly from the natural rock of the cliff itself. The whole project cost an estimated £12,000, roughly 25 million in today's currency. Richard reportedly visited the construction site constantly, and some historians believe he may have served as the castle's primary architect himself. When it was finished in 1198, Château Gaillard was the strongest fortress in Western Europe. Richard's statement to Philip could not have been clearer: "Come and take it." But Richard never got the war he was building toward. In April of 1199, while besieging a minor castle at Chalus in central France, a crossbow bolt struck him in the shoulder. The wound became infected, and the Lionheart died at the age of 41. He had spent barely a year enjoying the masterpiece he had poured a kingdom's fortune into building. His brother John inherited the English throne, and with it, the responsibility of defending Normandy. King John was many things, but a warrior king in the mold of his brother was not one of them. Philip II of France had been waiting for exactly this moment, and by 1203, he was ready to take everything Richard the Lionheart had fought to protect. Philip did not rush straight at Château Gaillard. He was too smart for that. Instead, he systematically captured the smaller castles surrounding it, cutting off supply lines and isolating the fortress from any hope of relief. Then, in September of 1203, he settled in for a siege. Inside the castle, the commander Roger de Lacy had a garrison of several hundred soldiers. But he also had a problem. When Philip's army appeared, the terrified civilian population of the town of Petit Andelys had fled up the hill and into the castle for protection. Suddenly, Roger had over 1,000 extra mouths to feed, with supplies meant for a fraction of that number. Roger made a brutal calculation. He expelled 500 civilians from the castle, sending them toward the French lines. Philip, perhaps feeling generous, allowed them through. A second group of similar size was released days later and was also given safe passage. But Philip realized what Roger was doing. Every civilian who passed through the siege lines meant the garrison could hold out longer. So when Roger expelled the remaining civilians, possibly as many as 1,200 people, Philip ordered his soldiers to stop them. The French opened fire on the group, driving them back toward the castle walls. The civilians turned and ran back to the gates, but Roger had already sealed them shut. For 3 months, through the freezing winter of 1203 and into 1204, hundreds of men, women, and children were trapped in the open moat at the base of the castle walls. They had no shelter, no food, no fire. The French would not let them pass. The English would not let them back in. More than half of them died. They froze to death in the Norman winter, or starved within sight of both armies. When Philip himself finally arrived at the siege in February of 1204, he ordered the surviving civilians released and fed. By then the damage was already done. With the civilians gone, Philip turned his full attention to breaking the castle. His engineers mined beneath the outer wall, digging tunnels and then burning the wooden supports until sections of masonry collapsed. French soldiers stormed through the breach and captured the outer bailey, but the middle and inner walls still held. The miners could not tunnel deep enough to reach the foundations of the second ring. It seemed like the castle's design was going to hold, just as Richard had intended. Then a French soldier noticed something. On the west side of the middle bailey, a latrine chute emptied through an opening beneath the chapel. The toilet drain was unguarded. The shaft was narrow, slippery, and ran straight up into the chapel above. A small group of French soldiers crawled up through the sewage. They emerged inside the chapel and immediately began making as much noise as possible, shouting and banging to make the defenders believe a large force had breached the walls. The panicked garrison tried to smoke them out by setting fires, but it failed. The soldiers in the chapel opened the gate to the middle bailey, and the rest of Philip's army poured in. The defenders retreated to the inner keep. Roger de Lacy held out for a few more days, but his garrison had been reduced to 20 knights and 120 soldiers. On March 6th, 1204, they surrendered. The castle Richard the Lionheart believed was impregnable had fallen, and it had been broken open through a toilet. The fall of Château Gaillard was catastrophic for England. Within months, Philip had swept through the rest of Normandy. Rouen surrendered in June. The entire duchy, held by English kings since William the Conqueror, was lost. King John's failure to relieve the siege or defend his brother's legacy contributed directly to the baronial revolt that would eventually produce the Magna Carta. But the castle's dark story was far from over. In 1314, Château Gaillard became the setting for one of the most disturbing chapters in French royal history. 3 princesses, the wives of the 3 sons of King Philip IV, were accused of adultery in what became known as the Tour de Nesle affair. The scandal began when Philip's daughter Isabella, who was married to King Edward II of England, noticed that 2 knights at the French court were carrying embroidered purses she had personally given as gifts to her sisters-in-law. The implication was damning. King Philip IV placed the knights under surveillance, and his spies confirmed what the purses had suggested. Margaret of Burgundy, wife of the eldest Prince Louis, and Blanche of Burgundy, wife of the youngest Prince Charles, had been conducting affairs with the knights Philippe and Gauthier d'Aunay, meeting them secretly at a guard tower along the Seine. The punishment was medieval in every sense of the word. The Downey brothers were arrested, tortured, until they confessed, and then publicly executed. Accounts describe them being castrated, flayed alive, broken on a wheel, and finally beheaded. Margaret and Blanche were tried before the Paris Parliament and found guilty. Their heads were shaved, they were stripped and dressed in sackcloth, and then they were sent to Château Gaillard, not to the castle's towers or its chambers, to underground cells. Margaret of Burgundy, who technically became Queen of France when her father-in-law, Philip IV, died later that same year, spent the rest of her short life in a freezing underground cell at the fortress her husband's ancestors had lost a century earlier. She died on August 14, 1315, after barely 2 years of imprisonment. The official cause was illness brought on by the brutal conditions, but the timing was deeply suspicious because her husband, now King Louis X, needed to remarry and produce an heir. He married his second wife just 5 days after Margaret's death. Blanche of Burgundy endured 8 years underground at Château Gaillard, 8 years in a cell carved into stone in a castle that had been crumbling for over a century. Her marriage was eventually annulled, and she was transferred to a monastery at Gavray, where she died around 1326. The succession crisis that followed the Tour de Nesle affair, the questions of legitimacy, the invocation of ancient Salic law to prevent women from inheriting the French throne, and the competing claims that arose when all three of Philip IV's sons died without male heirs. All of it contributed to the political powder keg that eventually exploded into the 100 Years' War. And through that war, Château Gaillard kept suffering. The castle changed hands between English and French forces multiple times. It was besieged again in 1419, holding out for a year before surrendering to the English. The French took it back in 1430, lost it again within a month, and finally recaptured it for good in 1449. By then, nobody wanted it anymore. The castle sat abandoned for 150 years, crumbling on its cliff above the Seine. Local outlaws and bandits moved into the ruins. When Henri IV became King of France around 1600, he ordered the castle demolished, partly because it was a security risk, and partly, some historians suggest, because his own father had been wounded in a battle near its walls and died at its base in 1562. The demolition was never fully completed. The walls were too thick, the stone too deeply rooted in the chalk cliff. What the demolition crews could not finish, weather and neglect slowly did over the following centuries. In 1862, France recognized what remained of Château Gaillard as a historical monument. Today, visitors can climb the hill above Les Andelys and walk among the broken walls. The inner keep still stands, scarred but upright. The views over the Seine Valley are stunning. The same views Richard the Lionheart saw when he chose this spot 800 years ago. But most people drive past without stopping. The castle does not appear on many tourist itineraries. It sits quietly on its cliff, overshadowed by more famous ruins, forgotten by most of the world, which is strange when you think about everything that happened here. A king's obsession turned to stone. Civilians frozen to death between two armies that refused to help them. A fortress broken open through a sewer. Queens left to rot in underground cells. Centuries of war, betrayal, and abandonment. Château Gaillard was never just a castle. It was a monument to what power costs and what happens to the people who get caught between those who wield it. If you found this story worth knowing, please subscribe. I cover the dark histories of places the world has forgotten every week. And if you want to see another castle with an even darker secret buried in its walls, that video is on screen now.